Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined, as always, by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. Today, we're going to be recapping all of the Week 11 action with an eye towards Week 12. But before we do that, just a note that we will not be discussing the 3 Thanksgiving games and the Black Friday game. If you'd like to hear our analysis, we're going to go extra in-depth on those games tomorrow afternoon with the two of us, myself, Josh Larky, and Ryan Reynolds, along with our head of DFS, Jordan Vanek. That's going to be an incredible show, blending fantasy, betting, DFS, breaking down that slate, since anyone out there who's ever played DFS knows that Thanksgiving is a time for turkey and a time for the 3-game slate. Ryan, why don't you start us off with our first Sunday game for Week 12?
A game that's suddenly very interesting with major AFC South ramifications. The Jaguars at the Texans. The Texans are currently a 1-point home underdog. Game total here is 47 points. Defense won this game for Houston last week against the Cardinals. Offense was very productive in both phases, but turnovers were a problem. One thing, Josh, here is that Singletary's now had 2 big games as a runner. What are you thinking about the Texans offense going forward?
Yeah, this is an offense. We've talked about it a few times now, where CJ Stroud, I think at this point, we're confident he's a fantasy elevator where he elevates everyone around him. What Devin Singletary's doing, what Nico Collins, Tank Dell, Dalton Schultz, what they're all doing has been elevated by Stroud. And I think this is just another great matchup. The Jaguars allow the 3rd most passing yards per game to quarterbacks. And I actually wrote an article on the 33team.com yesterday just discussing Tank Dell. He's the wide receiver 10 in fantasy points per game right now. I'll be ranking him ahead of Nico Collins in fantasy from here on out. And I just break down how historic his start has been through his first 9 games.
Jaguars, Josh, we talked about this last week. We played Trevor Lawrence in DFS. We thought that he was going to have a spike week against the Titans. I think I bet is over on the player prop happy hour as well. I think one thing that we have to do here going forward is Trevor Lawrence is going to be a factor for the next decade. He might have some lulls like every quarterback does for the most part, but by and large, he's still a top 10. He's a premium quarterback. What are you thinking about the Jaguars long-term here, Josh?
Yeah, one thing that I noticed, I kind of could feel this just when you watch the games, and it's the same thing when you look at the data, just how important Zay Jones is to this offense. It's kind of interesting. It's almost like a very fragile pass attack, where you really need Calvin Ridley on the outside, Christian Kirk in the slot, Zay Jones in that Z receiver role, and then Evan Engram at tight end, Travis Etienne in the backfield. It's a lot of big names, and you'd think a quarterback like Lawrence wouldn't need that, but I think it's a mix of it's still a developing offense, and the offensive line's been pretty bad. When Zay Jones has been on the field this year, Lawrence has a 103 quarterback passer rating. When Zay Jones is off, it drops to 88. And that's a pretty decent sample this year. Lawrence has actually yet to throw an interception all season when Zay Jones is on the field. So that's something to keep in mind that he returned last week. And not saying that every single week they're going to be lighting teams up, but just in general, the floor and ceiling gets raised when Jones is active.
That's Jay Larky Tweets. You can check out his fantasy rankings. They'll be on the site tomorrow afternoon on the 33team.com. Next up, Josh, Steelers at Bengals. Obviously, this game's much different with Joe Burrow out. Bengals are 1-point home favorites. Game total goes 35 points. Cincinnati's defense hasn't been the same this year without Jesse Bates. I think we saw that against Baltimore last week. For Jake Browning, I didn't really like him in college. I view him as a below-average backup. Bengals offensive line's better now than it was on opening day. That's the one positive I'll say about this matchup, because the Steelers have a premium pass rush. I think the Bengals at least have a chance to mitigate that to a degree. What do you think about the Bengals offense here, Josh?
Yeah, it's pretty bleak. We actually co-wrote an article for the 3013 that broke it down more in depth, but Joe Mixon's probably just a fantasy running back too, based on volume. The Steelers have been relatively friendly to running backs this year. 13th most fantasy points per game allowed, 6th most rushing yards per game. Mixon's going to get a whole lot of work. The passing game is what really concerns me. I think Jamar Chase he's probably like sneaking into the top 20. I'll work on my rankings tonight during the Monday game. He's probably a top 20 option this week. T. Higgins, if he plays, maybe he's a flex. Tyler Boyd can be dropped on all rosters. It's very, very bleak. I think what we've seen this year is that that have good and great quarterback play are just monumentally different to watch and for fantasy points than the teams that have the low end starters like a Desmond Ridder, or at this point now a backup quarterback like the Bengals do with Jake Browning.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I have no confidence in Browning at all. Next up, Josh, the Steelers side of things. We talked about this a lot. Pittsburgh's a quarterback away from being a perennial playoff team. Good young roster, excellent defense. I thought that Kenny Pickett was, and I'm using air quotes for our listening audience, was going to be fine. Fine, starting to look like the best case scenario. Unfortunately, he still has time to progress, but there's some pretty ugly metrics out there on Pickett. I know you weren't crazy about him as a prospect going into the offseason this year. What are you thinking about the Steelers offense?
Yeah, I've got a few good stats for the people. The past 2 weeks, no Steelers receiver or tight end has reached 8 PPR fantasy points.
Oof.
Pickett's thrown for 160 or fewer passing yards each of the past 4 games.
Yeah.
I won't say this is the get right game, but I think things they're looking a little bit up from the 160. The Bengals allow 8 yards per pass attempt. That's second highest in the NFL. The problem I think here, though, is that with Jake Browning at quarterback, the game plan is going to be so conservative. And Jaylen Warren's currently playing out of his mind. The past 3 games, he's averaged under 12 carries a game, yet 106 rushing yards per game. He's pretty much doubling Najee Harris's production on fewer touches. Still egregious that he's not just getting more touches each week. I think if for some reason it ends up being a Tony Pollard 2023 situation where Warren can't handle the high volume, we could deal with that. But at least right now, for a team that's really on the cusp of the playoffs, you'd think they just lean on their good playmakers, and we haven't quite seen that yet.
My survivor pool picks and predictions is out on the site already. I actually think the Steelers are an interesting aggressive play because of Jake Browning. Not safe at all, but we're getting late in the year. You might need to color outside the lines a bit in survivor. Next up, Josh. This game's going to be an affront to offense. Patriots at Giants. Giants are 3.5-point home underdogs. Game total here is 34 points. As we know, the Giants beat the Commanders last week. Tommy DeVito genuinely had a number of really impressive throws in that game. He took 9 sacks. Washington's secondary is horrendous enough where people should probably get fired sooner than later. We don't want anyone to lose their jobs, but that was a gruesome showing. We knew that pass defense was bad, but my goodness, unbelievable. One thing I'll say on a positive here for the Giants offense going forward is I actually thought Saquon Barkley looked more explosive than he has in basically 2 years. He made a difference in that game, pretty much the difference in that game. Do you have any optimism for the Giants offense going forward, Josh?
No. I like Saquon in fantasy. I agree. I thought he looked pretty good when I was watching that game yesterday. The big concern here for this Giants offense is that Bill Belichick, as we all know, has repeatedly shut down rookie quarterbacks. Tommy DeVito's an undrafted rookie. And the Patriots have been on their bye. So we've essentially given Bill Belichick 2 weeks to game plan against Tommy DeVito. I think the Giants are scoring under 7 points in this game.
Things don't get better on the Patriots side of things, Josh. Mac Jones, Bailey Zapp, doesn't really even matter who's at quarterback at this point. That said, I do think Bill Belichick facing Tommy DeVito is he's been making young quarterbacks' lives miserable for years. I think this could be a real problem. We talked about this right before we got on the show. I'm not sure the 34-point game total is low enough for this game. Again, do you have anything positive to say about the Patriots offense?
Not too many things. The committee with the Patriots backfield is still really much a thing. Ramondre Stevenson gets more carries. He runs more routes, but Zeke comes in and he gets the goal line carries as those precious few, and he gets more of the red zone work. I think for this game, Ramondre is going to be a fantasy running back too, because he gets more carries. I think they're going to be leading all game. And then if we look at Patriots to start in fantasy on the receiving end, I think it's just DeMario Douglas. Another game where he's just a volume-based wide receiver 3. His average depth of target's been under 6 yards on average the past 4 games, but he's getting a lot of targets. The Giants have struggled against receivers this year in terms of fantasy points allowed. So I think Douglas probably sneaks into the top 36, but the floor might be decent. The ceiling's really low when you're a Patriots receiver who has no red zone role and is not allowed to run downfield.
Just to be clear for the people, game totals with 34 or fewer points usually involve like 30-mile-an-hour winds. So maybe try to sit this one out if you're a viewer. Panthers at Titans is next up. Titans are 4-point favorites. That line actually surprises me a little bit that Tennessee's a 4-point favorite over anyone right now. 37-point game total. The offense under Will Levis was promising in his NFL debut. It's been non-functioning for the last 3 weeks now. The points against the Jaguars came late when the game was already out of hand last week. Tennessee's also in a weird spot with older skill position players. Their two headliners are Derrick Henry and DeAndre Hopkins. They're clearly in a full rebuild mode, maybe trying to find out if Will Levis can be the answer at quarterback. Things are not trending in that direction right now. What do you got on the Titans offense, Josh?
We could just pass this one back. My notes are that this is maybe the hardest offense to watch compared to I kind of like what you said. You're basically watching the twilight of Derrick Henry and DeAndre Hopkins' careers getting wasted at this point with Will Levis.
Yeah, it'd be nice to see those two guys at a contender. Not sure where they were and traded at the deadline. All you need to know about the Panthers football organization right now is they're 4-point underdogs to the Titans. Their offense did very little against Dallas last week. That's not a big surprise. Their defense actually played reasonably well against the Cowboys, though. Run defense was fine. Held Dak Prescott, who's been shredding people for a month now. Do you have any optimism for the Panthers right now, Josh?
No, but I've got a little bit more on the Panthers than the Titans. So I guess positively for Bryce Young, he gets the pass funnel defense with the Titans. That theoretically should help the offense tick up. He's been under 190 passing yards. He's been under just 5 yards per pass attempt even each of the past 3 games. The past 2 weeks, Jonathan Mingo has 13 targets. That's a lot. And he's caught 4 for 26 yards. I think that pretty much describes what we've seen from the passing offense this past month. And then at the running back position, we just can't start either of these guys because Chuba Hubbard, we talked about this for 2 weeks where we said, guys, be careful. This is not the obvious lead back going forward. Miles Sanders has the contract, and sure enough, it's now a 50-50 committee. You cannot start either of them in fantasy football, especially not against a pass funnel defense like the Titans. I think outside of Adam Thielen, there's not a single player that is worth rostering at this point in shallow leagues from the Panthers.
Saints at Falcons is kind of a good, bad game. One of these teams is probably going to win the NFC South. Neither one of them seems to actually want to, though. Falcons are 1-point home underdogs. Game total here is 41 points. Apparently, Arthur Smith's going back to Desmond Ridder. Musical chairs at quarterback for Atlanta. Not really building the offense around their 3 blue chip skill position players either. We obviously are not a huge fan of what Arthur Smith's doing either for betting or fantasy purposes. And, frankly, I'll never understand this kind of thing. Can you make any sense of the Falcons offense right now, Josh?
I really can't. I thought it was funny that Ridder was announced as the rest. It wasn't just that Ridder was announced as the starter for this week. He was announced as the quote unquote rest of the season starter. Speaking of Arthur Smith, we talk a lot about how after a bye week, rookies usage increases. I think Smith as coach is kind of the exception. I would not necessarily expect Bijan Robinson to dominate the running back touches. He might, but I don't think assuming that he'll flirt with his career high 22 carries from the week before the bye. I don't think we should just pencil that in for him. And just in terms of how bad this pass attack has been, I was looking at games with 15 PPR fantasy points from receivers and tight ends. Only the Giants and Titans have fewer of those performances than the Falcons. We have 2 from Drake London, 2 from Jonnu Smith, and just 1 from Kyle Pitts. I think if that doesn't get you frustrated for fantasy football and real football, then I don't know what would.
This team should be running away with the NFC South, Josh. The Saints, that is. These guys are actually one of the better rivalries in the whole sport. They play each other tight on a regular basis. New Orleans just continues to shoot themselves in the foot. I think they have a better, more consistent roster than the Falcons. But this is a coin flip game in general. I could see Atlanta actually winning this game, especially if Jameis Winston plays. I know people want Jameis Winston to play for fantasy purposes. He certainly was a good thing for Chris Olave when he came in last week, but he still throws wildly reckless passes. He threw a cross-field pass into the end zone against the Vikings. There's a reason this man threw over 30 interceptions in a season. What do you think about New Orleans with or without Carr here?
I think we'd prefer Winston for fantasy football, but I don't think it's quite as big of a chasm as some people actually make it out to be. The guy that I think is interesting, we talked about him before the bye, is Rashid Shaheed. With Michael Thomas on the mend for multiple weeks with a significant knee injury, Shaheed had a career-high 9 targets in the game before the bye. He only caught 5 for 24 yards. That makes him a great waiver claim because you can get him for cheap. And you might get a speedy starting receiver in a competent enough offense. The Falcons have struggled pretty heavily against slot receivers this year for fantasy points. And what's good is that both Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed get a very healthy amount of slot reps this year. They've done a really good job kind of rotating their receivers around the formation. So I'll be very confidently starting Olave, and I'll even be starting Shaheed in a couple leagues. And I think one of these guys is probably hitting 20 fantasy points in this matchup.
I like it. Next up, Josh, Buccaneers at Colts. Colts are 1.5 point home favorites here. Game total is 42.5 points. This might actually surprise you, Josh. I don't think any teams exceeded expectations this season more than the Indianapolis Colts. 5-5 record. They beat the Ravens in overtime in Baltimore. 2 quarterbacks have seen significant playing time this year. I don't really think the roster's that good. They're coming off a bye. This team has no business being alive in the playoff race. Do you see this differently than I do, Josh?
No, I agree. We talked before the season. I bet at long odds for the Colts to finish with the worst record in football. Looking last year, if you schedule adjust, the Colts had the worst point differential in the entire NFL last year based on their schedule. So by that metric, they were already the worst team in football with a roster that got worse and then trotting out what would be a rookie inexperienced quarterback. Like you said, the clearly overperforming. For this matchup, it's about the passing game. The Bucs give up the second most passing yards per game this year. The Bucs are, I believe, the only team at this point now that has not allowed a single rushing touchdown to a running back. We'll see if Jonathan Taylor breaks that curse. I would probably bet against him scoring a touchdown in this one, just given the Buccaneers and the fact that it is the Colts. Fortunately, though, for the pass game, it's Michael Pittman week. I think he's in for a big day. Same with Josh Downs. Bucs have allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to receivers at the 5th highest yards per reception. I think there's going to be some big plays in this game.
Reminder that Josh's fantasy rankings come out on the website on Tuesday afternoon, the33rdteam.com. See where he has Michael Pittman, see where he has Josh Downs, see where he has Jonathan Taylor. The Buccaneers, Josh, watching the Giants, watching the Jets has been hard this year, but I think Tampa might actually be my least favorite team to watch this season. Baker Mayfield's been good for him, which is, kind of a backhanded compliment, I suppose. Against the 49ers last week, he missed a number of downfield throws early in that game where if he makes them, even if he connects on 2 or 3 of them, I think Tampa might have actually been able to steal a win from San Francisco. But, what it ultimately boils down to is Baker Mayfield cannot carry an NFL offense week in and week out. Have any optimism for the Buccaneers offense here, Josh?
I think this will just be a classic 2023 Buccaneers game. Consolidated fantasy points. They're probably going to score 20 points overall in this one. One thing I'll note is that we talked about Rachaad White as a buy last month. He has at least 16 fantasy points now in 5 straight games, at least 15 touches in each of those games. So that's looking like a decent call on our part. I think it's important to remind people of that, not to just pat ourselves on the back for hits, but more so that it's our job to adjust. Neither of us were Rachaad White guys. We saw that his usage was better than we expected heading into the season. And rather than kind of digging our feet in and saying, no, this is not a talented running back, it's the Buccaneers, he has Baker Mayfield with him, we adjusted. And I think that's important. And Rachaad White seems like pretty much every week he's going to get it done in fantasy because he has this outrageous pass game role. Only Christian McCaffrey's had a better pass game role at the running back position this season.
Agree with you all the way there philosophically. I say this all the time. Fantasy is a variant of sports betting. Things change in football, especially with injuries. Players get better. It's always important to reevaluate yourself, audit your process. Just because we were down on Rachaad White before the season doesn't mean, we changed our minds halfway through because we saw his passing game role increase. Next up, Josh, Rams at Cardinals. Another coin flip game for people in winter pools. Cardinals are 1-point home underdogs in this matchup. Game totals 46.5. Arizona continues to be scrappy, especially on defense. Their defense kept them in that game against Houston last week because Kyler Murray had a number of opportunities late in that game to go ahead and go out with a lead on the Texans in the last 5-10 minutes. He had 2 or 3 drives where he really had a shot. Houston's defense, credit to them, they held up, but the Cardinals offense was a little worse this week than it was the previous week. What are you thinking about the Arizona Cardinals led by Kyler Murray going forward?
I think the big player to watch here is Marquise Brown. We were both very high on him. I know you in particular have always been a Marquise Brown guy. He's had back-to-back stinkers for real football, for fantasy, since Kyler Murray returned for these 2 games. I think one thing that's interesting is that his average depth of target was at least 17 yards in both games. They're really just using him more as this deep threat. I'll definitely be interested in looking at his receptions numbers in the prop market. I think they're probably going to scheme him up a lot of kind of layup receptions in this one. It just seems hard to believe that they'd go 3 straight games now where Marquise Brown is basically just running wind sprints at this point. That's not really what he's best at. It's not that he's bad at that, but he's more of a complete receiver than that. I don't know what you've seen on tape, but that's just one thing that I've noticed just from more casually watching the games and then kind of digging into the numbers.
Yeah, the last couple of weeks I've been kind of disappointed with how he's been used, especially based on, he was a volume monster when Hopkins was out last year. So hopefully greener pastures are ahead for him. But right now, I'm tempering my expectations in the short term. Want to see it first. For the Rams, Josh, the Rams have been the team we were expecting coming into the season when we were talking about them being a 4 or 5 win team. They're just, outside of McVay, Stafford, Aaron Donald, Cooper Kupp, they're a very limited roster. Stafford in particular, he missed Darrell Henderson on a wide open wheel route, a throw. Henderson might have scored a 70-yard touchdown on it. Stafford never misses that kind of throw. Another throw earlier in the game, he had Cooper Kupp downfield down the right sideline in the end zone, way offline throw. His finger seems to be bothering him. He seems to be gritting it out. And if Stafford's not at 100%, the Rams are a very volatile team. What do you think about Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, Matthew Stafford here, Josh?
Cooper Kupp had a low ankle sprain. I think he probably plays this week. Obviously, Puka Nacua is a top 3 fantasy receiver if Kupp misses. We all saw what happened at the start of this season. And I agree. I think Stafford's playing hurt. Stafford, this kind of surprised me. Did you know that Stafford hasn't hit 240 passing yards in a game since week 4? That's kind of the story. Yeah, that really surprised me too. That's kind of the story of this offense is that they started off really funneling through Stafford. He played really well. He gets hurt, and he just hasn't been the same since. One other fantasy note, Kyren Williams should return this week. His timetable's always been week 12. And if he does, I think he's a low-end fantasy RB1. Cardinals have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the position. Kyren Williams got pretty much every single touch in this backfield when he was healthy. And I haven't seen enough from Darrell Henderson or Royce Freeman for me to think that either of them carved out a meaningful role for when Kyren returns.
Next up, Josh, Browns at Broncos. Can't expect a whole lot of scoring here. Broncos are 1.5-point home favorites. Game total's 36.5. Even sounds like it's a little touch high, which is crazy to even consider. For Denver, I've received a few disparaging comments in power rankings because I've been inching the Broncos up past some teams. I think they showed last night that they're actually a pretty scrappy team that, again, given the injuries to Joe Burrow and so on, they're actually kind of alive in the AFC playoff race. Their early season defense is one of the most surprising things of the whole season to me. They were getting smoked in the first month of the season. Made no sense. Now, all of a sudden, they're a top 10 unit every week that's driving their success. You've had some interesting stats on Russell Wilson the last couple of weeks that I've put in my own content recently. It's fascinating. What do you think about Russ in the offense right now, Josh?
Yeah, the Russell Wilson's been kind of what people think of with Brock Purdy, this elite game manager. That's actually kind of what we've seen with Russell Wilson. Tons of touchdowns, almost no interceptions, and overall averaging like 200 passing yards per game. It's been kind of a unique experience. I think in this game manager Russ is going to come out in full force. I think we could very well see another 150 pass yard, 2 pass touchdown type of stat line. Browns have just shut down passing games completely. Running backs, though, have averaged the 7th most yards per carry against them. Javonte Williams is kind of monopolizing the carries in this backfield. He's the only good fantasy start from this Denver offense. Russell Wilson's kind of a low-end quarterback streamer this week because it's the Browns. I have no faith in any of these pass game options. So I think Javonte is kind of the place that I'm going in this matchup.
Yeah, I could see both teams trying to be run heavy. in a very tight game, similar to the Steelers game last week. We've been saying this for a lot, Josh. The song remains the same. Cleveland's a decent quarterback away from being a contender, from being a real problem for anyone. What I want to see here, Josh, is Joe Flacco takes the helm and then goes into Baltimore and knocks off the Ravens in the first round of the playoffs. I want to see the Joe Flacco revenge game, Josh, driven by defense. How about you with the Browns? Do you have any positive snippets here on the offense at all?
So positively, David Njoku had 15 targets last week. Only Keenan Allen had more targets last week. David Njoku's target share has been over 21% each of the past 5 games, at least 4 catches each of the past 5 games, double-digit fantasy points each of the past 5 games. With the really poor quarterback play, I'm sure you've seen it too when you watch the games, they're just scheming up touches, swing pass after swing pass, not to the running backs, not to Amari Cooper, but often just to David Njoku, and kind of letting him get some yards after the catch. The matchup's actually very friendly for this running game. It was already a pretty run-heavy, run-focused team with Deshaun Watson. Without him, it's gone even more heavily that direction. Broncos are allowing a league-high 5.8 yards per carry to running backs, 5.8 yards per carry. No other team is above 4.6. That's good for Jerome Ford, and it's good for Kareem Hunt. They've been splitting carries down the middle. Jerome Ford's getting more of the work near the goal line. And Jerome Ford's also a little more involved in the pass game, but I think they can both be pretty efficient on the ground here. And then I'm really, really glad they signed Joe Flacco, simply because Dorian Thompson-Robinson's not the answer. Both of his starts, he's been under 170 passing yards, under 4 yards per attempt, and his touchdown to interception ratio through 2 starts is 0 touchdowns with 4 interceptions.
It's almost kind of weird that the Jets didn't bring Joe Flacco in. And also, Josh, I don't think I've ever heard David Njoku and Keenan Allen's named in the same sentence before. That was fascinating. and in some ways, with the Njoku, and this is a question, with the Njoku usage, isn't it in some ways about time, considering what kind of athlete this guy is?
Yeah, I think anyone out there that plays Dynasty like we do, this is coming at this point, thinking about my rosters, maybe 6 years too late. So I've always liked that. He's one of the guys where people always talk about how drops don't matter. I agree, drops generally don't matter, but they've clearly mattered for David Njoku because he can't get consistent playing time, and he couldn't really get consistent target volume because of those mental mistakes throughout his career. So it's been good to see him put it together this year. Kind of the lone bright spot at this point in this pass attack.
Agreed. I've always been a Njoku guy myself. Chiefs at Raiders. We'll see Kansas City tonight. The Raiders right now are 10-point home underdogs. Game total's 44 points. I'll say this, Josh. I was very surprised by the Raiders' defensive effort last week in Miami. They kept them in the game all afternoon. That said, Josh, Aiden O'Connell's offense is not very good against real opponents. I'd go as far as to say that if Jimmy Garoppolo started last week, the Raiders might have actually won that game in Miami. What are you thinking here with Aiden O'Connell at the helm for Vegas?
Before touching on the Raiders, folks, this game's Chiefs-Raiders. The Chiefs played tonight against the Eagles. Ryan has a betting preview and just a general game preview up on the 33rdteam.com for Eagles at Chiefs. He does that for all the island games. His survivor thoughts are already on the website. They come out on Mondays. On Tuesdays, he has power rankings. On Thursdays, he has expert picks and predictions. On Saturdays, he lets you know what to bet on. And on Fridays, we record the player prop happy hour with prop bets. Ryan is a busy man. Follow him on Twitter at Ryan Reynolds NFL. Check out all his work on the 33rd team. All right, that was the fun part. The bad part, the Raiders. All right, let's talk about the Raiders. So in this matchup, the Chiefs have been a run funnel defense. I know that we've bet some DeAndre Swift overs for tonight. I don't expect anything to change when they face the Raiders with how they're game planning. They're going to try and shut down Aiden O'Connell completely and force Josh Jacobs to be inefficient on the ground. Fortunately, that generally results in fantasy points if Josh Jacobs is getting force-fed 25 carries. Chiefs have quietly been one of the NFL's best pass defenses this year. 5th fewest yards per attempt to quarterbacks, 6th fewest fantasy points per game. And then before we turn to the Chiefs, one note, since I'm sure we're going to get questions about rookie Trey Tucker, 3rd round pick by the Raiders this year. He had 7 targets in week 11. He had 114 air yards. He never had more than 3 targets in a game all year. He's 5'9", 180 pounds. His utility long-term is on special teams. And you can just let him stay on your waiver wire.
I remember you weren't big on him in dynasty season this offseason either, Josh.
No.
Bills at Eagles up next. Eagles right now are 3.5-point home favorites, 47.5 game total for this contest. Again, we'll see Eagles Chiefs tonight. I could see the Eagles beating Kansas City and then losing to Buffalo. Again, we'll talk about this later in the week maybe, but that would make sense to me. Buffalo's in desperation mode right now. One thing I'll say about the Bills offense is that they were on the field the whole game early on. The Jets offense was just non-functional. So some of the statistics for Josh Allen's offense were a bit inflated because they were literally on the field the whole game. I thought the macro game plan from Joe Brady was pretty good. They went at the Jets with their fast running backs in space. Stephon Diggs, he's becoming one of my least favorite players in the league because he just keeps talking when it's like, dude, you play with Josh Allen and there's a reason your statistics are as high as they are. You were the wide receiver 2 in Minnesota behind Adam Thielen. Relax, dude. Back to the running backs. James Cook used in space. Your boy Ty Johnson got some work too, Josh. You have anything to say about Buffalo's offense?
Yeah, it was Ty Johnson, not Leonard Fournette. That was interesting. That was exciting for my Ty Johnson love, not for the couple deep fantasy leagues where I've been stashing Lombardi Lenny. With the Bills, I would sell James Cook before this Eagles game if your trade deadline hasn't passed yet. The Eagles are the worst matchup for fantasy running backs. James Cook had 19 fantasy points yesterday. That's how you sell him. 19 fantasy points tied his season high, but the snaps were 32 for James Cook, 24 Latavius. Carries, 17 James Cook, 10 for Latavius Murray, and routes were only 13 for Cook, 11 for Latavius. They each got one of the 2 red zone carries. Pretty committee sounding running back room to me. And I just don't believe in James Cook as a talent. Latavius Murray's been quite involved recently. And I don't think Cook will even be in my top 24 running backs this week facing the Eagles on the road.
That's Jay Larky tweets. His weekly fantasy rankings are on the site Tuesday afternoons. Rest of season rankings come out on Wednesdays. Josh, Ravens at Chargers. Chargers are 4-point home underdogs. Game total here is 46 points. Sunday night football. We talk about this all the time. I watch every snap of every game so you guys don't have to. Josh digs through all the advanced analytics so you don't have to. And I'm trying to look out for you here. If you're creaming Justin Herbert, you need to stop. 2 weeks ago, he kept the Chargers in the game against the Lions almost single-handedly. Quentin Johnston's horrifying drop on that deep shot late in the game is the reason the Chargers lost. There were a few more key drops too. I know Keenan Allen had one.
It was right off his chest.
Yeah, that's uncharacteristic for him. There was another one earlier in the game on 3rd down that killed the drive. Our editor, Ian Kenyon, put in a long shot bet this draft season on the Chargers to take Jalen Hyatt in the 1st round. You guys in Los Angeles would have been better off if Ian was in the room, because I think if you had Hyatt, 1, he'd be a better fit for your offense, and 2, he would have caught that and scored, and the Chargers would be in the playoff hunt again. Don't want to be depressing about your team, Josh. I don't feel too bad because I'm a Giants fan. I've taken some in the chin this year. But what are you thinking about the Chargers now that their season is kind of sort of slipping away?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's just a catastrophic failure by the organization. This is Justin Herbert's final year of his rookie deal. You have a future Hall of Fame quarterback. He's been cost controlled for 4 seasons, and you wasted it. You wasted it. You wasted it. The Ravens allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this year, 12.5, and the fewest yards per pass attempt, 5.5. This is all not good for the Chargers, but I actually really like games like this when it's strength on strength, where we know that the Chargers can't run the ball, but they can pass the ball. And the Ravens actually have struggled against running backs this year, but they've been so shut down in the pass game. So I'm actually quite excited for this game, not just as a depressed Chargers fan, but just simply for the love of football. And I'll mention that Keenan Allen is just doing insane things. Keenan Allen is now the fantasy wide receiver 2, 22.8 fantasy points per game at age 31. He's defying all of the age models. And thank goodness, because Quentin Johnston, others out there are giving him absolutely no help.
It's true, Josh. One thing that I'm curious about in this game is that Baltimore really hasn't faced a lot of premium passers yet. They got C.J. Stroud on opening day, Joe Burrow in week 2 with his injured calf. Then the Colts, the Browns, the Steelers, the Titans, the Lions, they blew out Jared Goff's Lions. I think Jared Goff's kind of on the fringe of being a premium passer. He's good, not quite in that upper echelon, though. Cardinals without Kyler Murray, Geno Smith's not an upper echelon quarterback. Cleveland, Joe Burrow got hurt last week. So if the Chargers have one path here, it's that the Ravens are a little bit overrated statistically as a pass defense. We'll find that out this week. In general, Josh, Baltimore's always good. Lamar Jackson's good. Mark Andrews, obviously, a devastating blow for his passing attack. We talk about this every week. Not a very voluminous passing attack, but efficient. Lamar Jackson creates space with his legs. We saw that against the Bengals, too. Most of his big plays in that game came because of the athlete that he is. What do you think about, we got to talk about Zay Flowers a little bit, obviously, but what do you think about the Mark Andrews-less Baltimore Ravens offense?
Yeah, I was digging into some numbers, and I think first I just caution anybody out there. I'm sure I didn't want to circulate this stat because I think it's misleading. We're probably going to see it pop up the past few seasons. Lamar's yards per pass attempt are much higher when Mark Andrews is not on the field. And I think some people out there might try and skew that as they don't need Mark Andrews. I think I'd push back pretty strongly on this one. When Mark Andrews went down, you could see Lamar Jackson was visibly upset, nearly as upset actually as the injured Mark Andrews, who was kind of like slamming his hands and shaking them in the air. So I'm very concerned about the pass attack overall in terms of effectiveness. If we're speaking just from fantasy football purposes, Zay Flowers is the start of all starts. Chargers have allowed the most passing yards per game this year. Zay Flowers was already leading the team with a 24% target share, which was higher than Mark Andrews. I'm expecting his target share to be closer to 30%, maybe even 35% in a lot of these games moving forward where they're just funneling quick passes to him. And then I think Odell Beckham Jr. is a flex play. Ryan, you watch the games. Would you agree he's kind of looked healthier as the season's moved along? Maybe it's a mix of being healthier and also just reintegrating into football after nearly 2 years off. Is that kind of what you've seen out of him?
Yeah, I think those are both fair points. I don't think he's back to, being the New York Giants version of Odell Beckham by any stretch, but he's a good, solid veteran presence where he's definitely, in my eyes, the number 2 option in the passing attack right now.
Yeah, and then the last one is Isaiah Likely. I think he's a fine streamer. I don't want to get out over my skis like I did week 1 when I was like, guys, we should start Isaiah Likely. Mark Andrews is out. As a rookie, Isaiah Likely was averaging 23 yards per game. This year, he's averaging 8 yards per game. He simply has not been a factor at all. He's actually gotten more snaps this year in most games than last year, and they're just not using him at all in the passing game. That will change. He'll obviously average more than 8 yards per game rest of season, but I don't think we should frame his rookie season as what to expect or better for expectations. I think he's just in the streaming conversation right now based on matchup and kind of has to show us otherwise for us to adjust.
One concerning thing that I had with him last week is usually when a starter like Mark Andrews, where he's a big part of the game plan, goes out early, the backup sees an increased workload because he's filling in the same role essentially. So him seeing not a whole lot of usage in that game kind of concerns me a little. I view him as a stash/streamer as well. Last up, Josh, Monday Night Football, Bears at Vikings. Vikings are 3.5-point home favorites. Game total here is 45 points. Good chance Josh Dobbs starts somewhere next year. Atlanta would make a lot of sense, I think. Long term, I don't think what's going on in Minnesota actually helps the Vikings at all, because what's the ceiling outcome here, Josh? Minnesota makes the playoffs and then gets destroyed by San Francisco, Philly, or Dallas in most scenarios. Maybe they'd face the Lions and give them a game because they've already played each other twice, especially late in the year. I think maybe stealing a win against the Lions and losing the second round is the best case scenario. Not to dump cold water on Vikings fans. What's going on here is really interesting, and Brian Flores' defense has been great, but I do think we need to temper what we're thinking about the Vikings here so far, Josh.
I would agree. Justin Jefferson should return in this game. TJ Hawkinson's target share drops by about 50% in games that he plays with Jefferson compared to without. Jordan Addison's probably just a flex play type, maybe even someone that you just sit depending on matchups whenever Jefferson returns, where Addison will be the clear third pass game option with a Josh Dobbs offense, which means a mediocre passing quarterback with a lot of mobility who's sucking pass attempts out of the offense when he runs with his legs. At running back, we've talked about this for 2 weeks now. There might be a changing of the guard. Ty Chandler's been out playing Alexander Mattison. Alexander Mattison stinks. Madison was way less efficient last night. He had 18 carries for 81 yards. Chandler had 10 carries for 73 yards. Madison had 5 of the 6 red zone carries. I don't think Chandler's really going to be in the mix to get a ton of those. I think he's going to get a lot more of the base down work, ideally, going forward. And then the pass game, we talk over and over about how Alexander Madison's one of the worst receiving backs in the entire NFL. He ran 20 routes yesterday, was targeted twice, had 1 catch for -1 yards. Chandler did not run 20 routes. He ran 7. And on his 7 routes, 4 targets. One of them was even in the red zone, and he caught all 4 for 37 yards. Ty Chandler should be getting pretty much all the pass game work and most of the base down work. I'd probably just defer to Madison in the red zone due to his size. But even then, with his fumble issues, I don't think it would be the craziest thing if Chandler can start to take and eat into that as well. So I think if you're looking for someone whose role can grow, Ty Chandler looks like one of the better running backs in fantasy for those purposes of right now. You can probably start him in a lot of weeks. And then if something happens to Madison or if he keeps chipping away at it, you suddenly have a running back with 4 wheels with some pass catching ability on an offense that's just good enough. And that's an every week fantasy RB2.
You know, Josh, we'll never frame ourselves as guys that get everything right. No one does. But you nailed Alexander Mattison. He's been a crater for your fantasy team this season. Next up, and last year, Josh, is the Bears. You know, I've been saying for weeks that the Bears are closer to being the good team than most people think. I've been saying this since they acquired Montez Sweat. He's transformed that pass rush. They're not an elite pass rush, but they went from a team that had no 4-man pass rush to a disruptive unit that's around 20th in the league, I'd say right now. You know, if they get Marvin Harrison in the draft and then they add another blue chip prospect to this thing, if Justin Fields can play at a consistent level, the Bears could be a playoff team next season. Now, Josh, last week I warned people up against taking the Lions in Survivor because I thought the Bears were going to give them a run. If Chicago keeps doing what they're doing, I think they can do the same thing in Minnesota this week. What do you think about the Bears for fantasy purposes?
So yesterday, Khalil Herbert had 16 carries. Deonta Foreman had 6. Roschon Johnson also had 6. Foreman was the one that had the red zone carry. He's the one that had both goal line carries. Foreman's banged up. I'm not sure if he plays this week. Herbert also actually ran more routes even than Roschon Johnson. I think there's a big role on tap for Khalil Herbert in this game. So I think based on volume, you can start him in fantasy. But just a reminder that the Vikings have been a brutal matchup for running backs. Just brutal. Any stat you look at, it's terrible. And then you remember that the Eagles' elite run game gashed them for 200 yards back in week 2 on that Thursday night game. And even with that game on there, still terrible matchup. So Herbert, low-end fantasy RB2, because I know a lot of people are going to say, oh, is this just a smash start if Deonta Foreman's out? And then before I've dropped this one last stat to close out the show, folks, remember Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. All of his works on the33rdteam.com. Survivor, power rankings, expert picks and predictions, prop betting, general bets that he's looking at for each game, island game write-ups for the matchups. You need to be following Ryan's work and reading it throughout the week. I know that I do. I know that him watching every snap of every game since 2014 has been a net positive for how I understand and consume football based on his insights. And I think I'll leave the folks with this for week 12. The past 3 full games with Justin Fields, weeks 4, 5, and 11, Justin Fields is averaging over 28 fantasy points. And here's DJ Moore's stat lines those past 3 games. 8 catches for 131 yards, 1 touchdown, 27 fantasy points. 8 catches, 230 yards, 3 touchdowns, 49 fantasy points. And 7 catches, 96 yards, and a touchdown, 22.5 fantasy points. DJ Moore in store for another huge week in week 12.